Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Southwest Center for Human Relations Studies at the University of Oklahoma for our monthly webinar series. I'm Asia Mutes, Project Development Manager, and welcome to the 2020-2021 season of our monthly webinars. Our hope is that we continue the conference's tradition of working to improve racial and ethnic relations on college campuses by providing virtual learning opportunities. We're grateful for Baker College for being a gracious sponsor of this presentation. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, NCORE offers 2 webinars per month on the first and last Wednesdays. Our Emerging Scholars webinars are held on the first Wednesday and focuses on ideas that speak directly to the experiences of students and is either facilitated or co-facilitated by a student. They are intended to identify emerging scholars and connect students in the NCORE community to each other. These are always available at no cost. Our Seasoned Scholars webinar are held on the last Wednesday of every month, with the exception of December, and they are offered for $25. We are working really hard now to finalize the entire season and plan to have all of the sessions released by the end of August. As always, make sure you're live posting. We want to know where you're watching. So tweet, Instagram, and Facebook pictures from your office with the hashtag NCORE and the hashtag Start the Conversation Online. This is the way we can stay connected in a time where connection is really, really important. Today we have Christina Marshall, Department Chair of the Human Services Program for the Baker College System, Dr. Latasha Reedus, Professor of Sociology at Columbus State Community College, and Jonathan Page, Director of Multicultural Affairs at Longwood University. Today, they will discuss privilege, colorism, and concerns some of our students, staff, administrators, and faculty of color may face this fall with the introduction of masks in a COVID-19 world. The center is grateful for their expertise.
Thank you, Asia, for that lovely introduction. I am Christina Marshall, and I'll let our other 2 panelists just acknowledge themselves at this point.
I'm Jonathan Page.
I'm Latasha Reedus.
All right, we're so excited to be here today and to discuss this conversation about masks. So we're going to begin by asking everyone, if they would, to please close their eyes for a moment. And as you close your eyes, we would like for you to imagine a dark-skinned man with a baseball hat and a mask covering his face. This man is sitting in your class. This man could be sitting in the lobby of the Student Center. Maybe he's walking around campus. How do you feel? How will you respond? What is going through your mind? You may open your eyes. These are the questions that we need to think about prior to the start of our classes this fall. How do we address implicit biases, assumptions, stereotypes, perceptions, and misrepresentations? Think about some of the encounters that have happened on a much broader scale. The officer in Miami who was seen handcuffing a Black doctor who was wearing a protective mask outside his home. The 2 men who were wearing surgical masks that were followed out of an Illinois Walmart, where the police department later said the officers had asked for their IDs after wrongly telling them about a city ordinance prohibiting wearing masks. And then here recently, where we have people in a Minnesota Walmart wearing swastikas. These highly publicized incidents are now amplifying our concerns, not only on how we will be viewed and treated, but also now question our safety. See, it doesn't matter how hard we try or how educated we are. because at the end of the day, the three of us are still Black in America. And the thought of how that looks in a mask scares me. Today's discussion is an opportunity to re-envision how we think about masks on our college campuses. When you intermingle face coverings, physical distancing, race, gender, class, some of our students, our faculty, and staff become at risk. So how do we position our campuses in a way that these disparities are not magnified by our faculty, staff, and students in order to make them feel safe as they enter our campuses this fall? The three of us come from different college systems within our institutions. We're at private colleges, public, community, four-year institutions, and we also come from different positions within our institutions, such as full-time, part-time, adjunct, full-time faculty, and administration. We are happy to share with you our thoughts on the issues of masks and its symbol of a much bigger and more complicated problem that we want to be prepared for this fall. Our conversation today will include several areas that we would like institutions to consider. We ask that you save all of your questions until the end of our discussion. At this time, what we would like from you is for you to, in the chat box, tell us how masks can be seen as weapons. How masks can be seen as weaponizing. So we're going to take just a few moments to have you put those items in the chat. And after we have received a few of them, then Latasha will start talking to you about what that means and how that may look.
As they're coming in, the first thought that I have is that nothing's really positive. We're seeing stereotypes, violent, threatening, can't read expressions, concealing. Someone made a comment about how you used to not be able to come into a bank, and I think that might still be the case with glasses or a hat or a mask of that nature. Seen as threatening, may not be able to distinguish gender or make assumptions about gender. I mean, it's obvious that as these comments are coming through, that there is some concern that you all have, that you see what we normally encounter in our everyday existence as it relates to masks in just a normal everyday setting situation, and how when we see people with them, our immediate thought, whether it's implicit bias or not, is to think of the negative, where they're talking about the stereotypes that are associated with people of color, specifically Black men, where they're talking about stereotypes that might be associated with people from particular regions of the world from an ethnic standpoint, whether we're talking about just how we as a society are so used to being able to see people's face, to gauge intent, to look at people's eyes. And even when we see their eyes, we still want to see the full face to get an idea of what is your intent to me? Are you welcoming? Are you approachable? Or what kind of signals am I sending to you if I myself am not masked up? So just as these things keep coming in, being treated negatively until they recognize who I am. And yes, the only positive so far I've seen someone talk about is being able to spread or stop the spread or the transmission of the COVID-19 virus, which is why we're all in this day and time masked up anyway. And so even though we know that is the intention, we know that we as human beings and as people will oftentimes fall back into those implicit biases and their stereotypes and those prejudices that we all hold. And it's unfortunate, but it is, I think, a fact of life and reality that we all have to be willing to acknowledge. We have to acknowledge that our coworkers, our colleagues, whether they are faculty or staff, regardless of what degrees they have, are going to bring some implicit biases to the classroom, to the buildings, to the campus community. We have to be able to acknowledge that students are also going to do that same thing. And what's most important is we have to be willing to acknowledge that we ourselves have some implicit biases, regardless of how much we think we are an ally or a social justice warrior. And so we have to be able and willing to confront those biases that we may or may not have as it relates to the mask, be willing to understand that this is a conversation that our colleges and universities have to be willing to get involved in. As much as we've spent a lot, and I know we'll get into that a little bit, about what our institutions are doing from the health perspective and all of these other guidelines as it relates to COVID, we have to also, unfortunately, realize that this is an element of discussion that oftentimes, and I think just from the conversations the three of us have had, and I'm assuming that some of you online will be able to say the same thing, this conversation is lacking within our campus leaderships and our task force and all these groups that we have put into place to deal with how are we going to educate our students and reopen our doors and be about the business of our institutions.
Thank you so much. Jonathan, would you like to add on to that and to maybe talk specifically about how the different types of masks may look on campus, et cetera?
Absolutely. That's something that we've started to have some significant conversations about on our campus. We are located in a very rural area of the Commonwealth of Virginia. And Virginia is, or was during the Civil War, the capital of the Confederacy. And you may have heard, in the news, all of the Confederate monuments, that have been taken down in the city of Richmond. We're only about an hour away from the Capitol. So there's been a tremendous amount of backlash. And so what we're starting to see is people, around the Commonwealth with Confederate flag masks. So we're seeing, the messages being weaponized, on the mask itself in a form of intimidation. We've seen masks with Klan hoods on them. We've seen masks with blackface, characters with blackface on. So again, it's those sort of implied threats, to the masks, and that's something that's very real. That we need to start to address, because many institutions coming into the fall semester, those who are meeting in person, are going to have some mask requirements. So what's going to happen on campus if you have students who have Confederate flag masks, or as you saw in the Walmart, wear the swastika or the blackface or the I can't breathe or the Black Lives Matter, or we know that this is speech. So, how do professors in the classroom handle that? How do administrators around campus, how do the staff who are engaging with students in the front line, how are we expected to handle that, to deal with that? It's a very uncomfortable situation. People do not want to necessarily confront. And again, because, if you're at a public, state institution, again, grounded in free speech, what are the limits of, policy enforcement? So these are the very real challenges, that we're trying to face. And I don't know, as Latasha said, I don't know if we are, prepared to have those conversations the way that we should.
Thank you so much. Latasha, I'm going to come back to you. Can you talk to us about how the mask can be worn as a sign of statements and how that may look in classes and some of the concerns that may surround that this fall?
I think we have to realize that on all our college campuses, we try to encourage students to, let's just say, use their voice, be an agent of change, social change, political change, whatever it is that they have a passion about, so to speak. At the same point in time, we also try to encourage students to be willing to listen to and hear other opinions and other viewpoints. But we also realize that sometimes certain things can be distracting, whether they're distracting to us as the person who's teaching the class, whether they are distracting to the people who are in the class, the students in and of themselves. It's one thing, when you see a student come in with maybe a t-shirt that has a political statement. Well, you can kind of look away from a t-shirt, I think, if that makes sense. You may see somebody who's wearing a t-shirt and it's not necessarily, I don't think it's going to be as distracting to you as a mask has the potential to be based on what the statement is. We all have college, we all are working for institutions that have some type of student code of conduct, the student handbook that says what you can and cannot do, what we consider to be disruptive, what's a violation, you know, what type of speech we feel is a violation of just the overall ethical and moral fabric of our particular institutions. So one of the things I think we need to be cognizant about is, now that we have these masks, where are we drawing that line, or are we drawing it at all? I mean, I think most of us, I mean, it's one of those things when you do this in front of like a computer screen where you can't say show of hands, but I'm fairly certain that everyone who's tuning in today has a mask, whether it is a little, what do you want to call it? The little cheap ones you get, you know, I shouldn't call them cheap, but you know what I mean? The ones that don't really mean anything. And then those that you might have had someone buy or make. My mother, for instance, is older, retired. And so one of the things that she's been doing is making masks with a lot of the different material that she had. And it was interesting because people said, oh, well, can she make a mask with maybe this sports team on it or this particular color? So people know that if I'm going to wear a mask, I want to also use it to maybe represent, for lack of a better phrase, my allegiance or affiliation to a particular sports team, state, organization that we may or may not be in, social movement. So we can't be surprised that students are going to want to do the same thing. So that's where the conversation becomes a little nuanced. When you have a student who comes into class with maybe a mask saying Black Lives Matter, as opposed to someone who comes in with a mask on the other side saying all lives matter. When you have a student who comes in wanting to express their thoughts on whatever political or social issue is important to them, and then someone else having a different point of view, because then it becomes a very fine line where we as faculty and, to be honest, as administrative staff dealing with students, are we the arbiter of what is appropriate and what is not appropriate? It's a situation that I think we are all going to encounter more and more and more frequently, but we haven't really given it the attention that we need to give it. Now, obviously, I'm supporting the Black Lives Matter, but how do I make sure that my own particular personal or professional views do not infringe upon a student who might have a different view? And then as a person who's in front of the class, if I'm a faculty or an administrator, am I allowed to have some type of slogan on my mask, have our institution say what you can and cannot do? And so it's, you know, those are those things that we have to continue to work through, but they are setting a tone. And we have to be intentional about what we want that tone to be, or at least be willing to discuss the different nuances that are associated with it.
So this gets to one of our points as it relates to policies. And I think Jonathan brought this up earlier as well. In terms of, as an adjunct, as a faculty member, what are my boundaries? What are my limitations in enforcing some of these policies that you just talked about, Latasha, as it relates to regulating what students or faculty members can and cannot wear? Do I feel comfortable as an adjunct faculty, or do I feel comfortable as a faculty member enforcing these rules? One of the things that I can say that at our institution, at Baker College, they have done an excellent job in terms of setting up a check-in point. And we talked about this in our conversations previously. They set up a check-in point, whereas if someone is wearing something inappropriately, they would be stopped there. So they wouldn't even get to the classroom, whether it's a faculty member, whether it's a staff member, whether it's a student, to have some type of mask that would be deemed as offensive to someone else. So what would you say, we'll start with you, Jonathan. What would you say in terms of policies as they relate to having faculty members or having staff enforce some of these policies? Do you think that people are comfortable? Do you think that there are institutions that have some of these policies set forth already as we enter our fall semester?
I definitely think some institutions are having those very conversations. When it comes to sort of that comfort level of being the enforcer, of the policy, I think that's where things get, a little bit more tenuous because I know personally, I'm an administrator, but I'm also considered staff. And, I have a 1-year contract. They can be renewed, but it's not guaranteed. So there is not necessarily safety or security. And, so that becomes sort of the challenge. Do I feel like I'm empowered, to be able to sort of enforce this? And, that's also one of the main differences between being in a public institution versus a private. Privates, you have a little bit more flexibility and leeway in how policies are enforced and, punishments, that can be meted out, if there have been violations of those policies. With the publics, it's a little bit more challenging, to do that. And as one person just kind of pointed out in the chat is who becomes then the arbiter of what's offensive or not, because again, we're talking about speech. And so, the mask then becomes an extension of that. So if it is sort of anathema to me or to my values or beliefs, is that justification enough to sort of enforce that policy? Or, as Latasha pointed out before, I have to be aware of my own perspectives, my own biases, that I'm bringing into this situation that, why am I having this reaction to this mask? So I think, you touched on, I think the essential question is, what is going to be the administration's stance? What is the institution's position, vis-a-vis, the masks and enforcement? For some, because it's, a stated policy, there is certainly, actionable steps that one can take because again, you're violating a code of conduct, those expectations and things. So you can certainly go that punitive route there. But I think we're just at the sort of the nascent stage of having those discussions on what we should do. But I know on my campus, that's one of the great, fears that, staff in particular are having. It's, do they feel that they have the authority to be able to challenge, to question, to sort of enforce the policy, as written? And what's going to happen if a student doesn't comply? What steps do we take then? Because again, many institutions have sort of disruptive behavior policies, on the books that you could look at and say, well, this was a failure to comply. But again, by the same token, what if you ask for a student's name and they don't give it to you? Or they give you a false name, or you ask to see their ID and they say no. Does this mean that we're going to resort to us as faculty, staff, and administrators breaking out our cell phones with our cameras and taking a picture that we can submit, to the dean of students or to campus police to identify who this was? And so it really opens up this Pandora's box. So I don't think right now there are any real easy answers to it, but these are the very real conversations that we need to start engaging.
Those are some great points for us to start thinking about. Latasha, can you talk to us from an adjunct faculty perspective of how you feel and how others may feel as it relates to enforcing policies in the classroom?
Sure. Again, from the adjunct perspective, and if there are any adjuncts on the watching right now, how tenuous that feeling can be at times. You're working at one institution, 2, 12, whatever you feel like you need to do to basically be about your craft. For me, I think it really depends on how connected that particular adjunct is to the people that they report to. I'm at Columbus State Community College in Columbus, Ohio. So for me, it would be, who is my lead faculty, who is the department chair, and what type of directives are they sharing with all of the faculty who report to them, particularly the adjuncts. The fact remains is a lot of adjuncts don't spend as much time on campus as full-time people. And as point of, disclosure, before I was doing the adjunct gig, as I like to call it, I worked for 9 years doing multicultural student affairs. So I know what it's like to be that full-time administrative staff person, but also be on the faculty side. An adjunct position is so tenuous. I mean, just as Jonathan said, year to year, we're talking about semester to semester, and you might have one class or not. So it's about how empowered, I believe, that adjunct might feel, or even how much, I'm trying to find the right word, buy-in or connection they even feel to that institution. I mean, I feel very connected to Columbus State Community College because I've been there for so long, and the support that I know I have from the people I report to. But at the same time, I have to be honest, I don't know how comfortable I would feel with having to police certain elements of a mask, especially if it's one thing for it to be something that I might not necessarily agree with, and that's a totally different conversation. But if we're talking about another student, because those of us who have taught, we've had situations where we've had students who will either email us or talk to us after class about a comment that was made that was, let's just say, uncomfortable or disrespectful or bothersome to them. And so then in the teaching position, you have to kind of navigate with them, and then you have to come back maybe the next day and talk with these things in maybe like a very broad, generic kind of, hey, someone approached me about this. We need to be mindful of being considerate, to other people's lived experiences. It's a little bit different though when you're talking about, okay, I've had a complaint that someone had a mask with a Confederate flag, or someone had, a mask about Black Lives Matter that they felt to be, disrespectful or uncomfortable. It just takes, it's like you're adding another layer of responsibility to what you already want your part-time faculty to do. To be honest, although I'm not, staff anymore, I would say that I would think it might even be similar to some of your more junior staff, like, people who are residence hall directors and things of that nature, who are younger, maybe not as seasoned, and still trying to figure out what authority that they have and being comfortable in that role. Now, if I had to do it, if my institution said, if this happens, you need to take X, Y, and Z steps, I mean, I'm sure I would, but I would want to be very sure that they have my back and that they support me based on whatever the fallout may or may not be. And again, I'm at a regional campus, so primarily at a regional campus, sometimes I'm on the main campus. So then you get those other nuances, into, where do you go? Can you really ask a student to leave? It's, I hate to say it's messy, but it's just messy because there's just so much uncertainty.
So in the chat, someone was talking about adding policing to their classroom experience and in their job as well. So that's something else that we would have to look at and address too. You talked just a moment ago, Latasha, about do you feel comfortable? What is your allegiance to the institution, etc. And now we're adding one more layer potentially is policing. If they don't have a policy in which there may be a check-in policy, etc. prior to that. One of the questions or one of the statements in our chat was also about what do we do if someone refuses to wear the mask? At our institution, again, at Baker College, we already have a check-in policy. So if they refuse to wear the mask, then they wouldn't get any further. But what are some of the other institutions, such as yours, Jonathan, doing if someone refuses to wear a mask?
That's actually something that we're in discussions with right now. We have a couple of preliminary policies in place. I know that every public institution in the Commonwealth of Virginia had to submit to the State Council of Higher Education in Virginia, as well as the Virginia Department of Health, their plan coming into the fall on what the procedures were going to be regarding masks and social distancing and the like. So, our plan going forward is we're requiring masks. In the event, however, that students, refuse to wear them, in some instances, the institution is trying to provide one. So if someone is not wearing it, you certainly, provide it for them. But in terms of the enforcement, if a student just out and out refuses to, that kind of borders on that failure to comply. And again, it is the expectation. So now you're talking about potential conduct charges. But again, the challenge is, with the enforcement of it, it's a little bit easier, I think, in a classroom setting where faculty members, have rosters, they kind of know who the students are so they can identify. But for those who are, staff in particular on campuses who may or may not know who the students are, that policing aspect, then becomes, again, the real challenge. And I think challenge is the watchword of the day, I think, because what are we going to chase people around campus and, you make them put it on or, contact campus police? And because campus police has already said that they cannot intervene unless it is disruptive or it becomes physical, violent. So again, that puts then the responsibility on staff or on faculty. So again, these are some of the preliminary discussions that we're starting to have. Talking to some other colleagues at some other institutions, particularly one of my good friends that are private. They're saying if a student doesn't do it, then immediately they go right to conduct board, and there are consequences for that. So I think really that's the biggest challenge that we face, particularly at a public, that you can require it, but if they don't comply, what is the natural recourse? And so it's trying to figure out through conversations with university council, what can we do legally? What can we do based on institutional policy, codes of conduct, and things like that? So really, this is sort of that unknown element.
So as we think about the mask and the conversation about people wearing or not wearing the mask as well, this also leads us to things like accessibility. So when we think of accessibility, there may be instances where some people cannot wear a mask due to medical reasons. There may also be some accessibilities. Now that we are wearing these masks, we have to think about, you've said that all of us have said that it's going to be a requirement at each one of the institutions. So now that we're requiring the wearing of these masks, then how does that relate to our faculty, our staff, our students who may have issues with wearing the mask, or who we may not have known prior, but they may have some medical reasons or some hearing problems, some hearing loss that we didn't know before, because they could read lips in addition to maybe hearing somewhat. So how would you look, Latasha, could you talk to us about the accessibility piece and how that may look this fall?
I think, again, challenging is the key word, and it is going to be challenging for us because we are asking people in certain situations to out themselves, for lack of a better phrase. Those people who may have, say, maybe medical or health conditions where the mask really is a difficult thing for them to wear. What does that mean if they are sitting in a class or coming to visit the dean's office or what have you as a student, and they've pretty much been told they have to, but they can't. So where do you fall into there? We're also dealing with what I have seen as far as employees, and that would cover all faculty and staff. I had a conversation with a colleague of mine who was telling me that she has underlying health conditions. However, her health conditions don't meet whatever standard her institution has set in place, so she could have her request to work remotely filled. So she has to be, basically they told her you can't work remotely, you have to be here, even though she has these documentations. So what is that meaning for her? Because again, a lot of the issues from a health, or I like to call them the unseen ability or disability issues that some people have, that's something that it's unseen for a reason. They choose not to talk about it, or it's just not as visible. So now you're putting some students as well as some faculty in a situation where they have to out themselves. We've talked about the people who may have hearing issues, who depend on being able to read lips and not being able to do that anymore. And I can tell you from a faculty standpoint, I've dealt with students who may be registered with the Office of Disability Support Services to make sure that they're there, but it's only like on an as-needs basis. For their own personal reasons, whether it's labeling, stigmatization, or they just feel like they don't need it as much, they often don't use that office unless they have to. They're the ones who, when I get the paperwork, they'll pull me to the side after class or whatever and say, yes, I know my paperwork is there, but however, I prefer to take the exams or whatever in class, because I'm just more comfortable. I want to be able to ask questions, all those type of things. So we're now looking at, other students who have to, unfortunately, continue to out themselves in a situation, in a scenario that it just may not make the overall learning process as well as we wanted. I know the three of us have talked about this, and I think I saw early up in the chat about how also the mask can hide I don't want to say hide, but the mask can make it difficult in some situations to identify someone's gender. When I'm talking about their outward presentation, you know, people think that they can just look at somebody and see if somebody has short hair, long hair, hat, whatnot. But, you know, sometimes you really do need to see that full face. And so you also can run into a situation, and Jonathan knows a little bit about this as far as, you know, students who, when it comes to their sexual orientation identity, being able to come out on their own timeline in their own narrative on a college campus, but how even that mask can really make that a difficult navigation process for them. I have had, for instance, transgender students in my class where the roster might say Emily, but then when I call their name, they'll say, but I go by either a very male name, I'm putting that in air quotes, or a more gender neutral name. So it's one thing for them to tell me that because they want to make sure I know. It's another thing for them to kind of be forced into, you know, a situation from an accessibility standpoint. So I think, again, we need to be mindful that whether you are dealing with a student in your class or students who's in your office or in your residence hall or on your sports or athletic team, you know, it's going to be challenging. I mean, I think this is just a semester of challenges upon challenges upon challenges that a lot of us are trying to get ahead of, but it's so difficult to get ahead of it and even catch up to it because there's so much that's really unknown.
Thank you. I saw also in the chat, someone talked about at their institution, they are providing masks in the clear ones so that people can read lips. And that is a fantastic way to address some of these issues. However, some of our institutions don't have that ability, whether it be for cost, etc. We also have to talk about the fact that when we look at a mask and the accessibility, what that looks like from an administrative perspective as well, and what that looks like in terms of the requirement all by itself to wear a mask. To wear a mask means unless the institutions are going to provide them, which it looks like some institutions will be providing them. I know that our institution will provide them. And again, if they're inappropriate, if they're deemed inappropriate by our administration, then they will be given one that is much more neutral, that just says Baker College. But other than that, when we think about our accessibility as well, we also want to think about what that means in terms of people being able to afford a mask. Because you're supposed to wear a different mask every day, or at least wash your mask out. Does everyone have the ability to wash those masks out if they're not going to be provided a mask? And then I believe that, Latasha, you talked earlier about the different type of masks. And we also know that some masks are much more protective than other masks. So when we think about accessibility, we're thinking about not only do we have to, Latasha, as you talked about, outing yourself potentially, but we also have to think about how our students or how are people going to get all these masks and have the ability to possibly wash them or purchase them. And then some of the policies that we have are related to even having individuals have to report or have a doctor's note if they can't wear a mask. So when we go back to talking about not wearing a mask too, there are some institutions that are talking about having a policy that if you cannot wear a mask, then you have to get a doctor's note. Now think about that. That by itself is a privileged response because not everyone has the opportunity or the money to go and go to the doctors to get a note. Or what happens if you're in an area that you have to be positive, tested positive. If you think you have COVID, they will not have you in class, and now you got to go get a test. And so maybe the testing is not as readily available in your area. And even though we all know they're supposed to be free, we know that people are being charged. So Jonathan, what would you say about the accessibility as it relates to privileges?
Yeah, I think we need to never lose sight of the fact that masks truly are a commodity, very much like food, water, and when you think about those communities and identities that are marginalized, then it does oftentimes put them at the disadvantage. And so, if you're fortunate enough to work at an institution, that is able to provide masks to students, that's great. But I tend to think of, we serve the rural community. And I know for a fact there are quite a number of students who don't have the wherewithal to have multiple masks. I know I've talked to students throughout the summer, checking in on people, and we do a weekly meeting with students. And several of them have indicated that in their communities where they don't have masks, they try to wear, bandanas, or some other type of face protection. And when they've gone into stores, they've been told that that's not a legitimate mask and they have to remove it and they have to leave. So now we get into this notion of, well, what constitutes a mask? What's legitimate? Are we talking about any face covering? So could it be a handkerchief, a bandana? Does it have to be, sort of those surgical type masks, or a homemade mask? Or so we start to kind of get into that. So, the accessibility becomes the challenge there. Another thing, as you pointed out, Christina, which I think is such a salient point, is when we talk about disinfecting a mask, and we're supposed to have multiple and be able to wash. But if you don't have the wherewithal to do that, our institution has talked about, using certain disinfectants on a mask and, letting it dry 24 hours. But, again, where is one going to get those particular disinfectants to be able to do it? So does that put the wearer at risk, to, continue to wear a mask, day after day after day without having, the ability to kind of clean it? What does that do to, people, in a classroom? If someone, is continuing to rewear a mask that potentially could be carrying, some of those germs. So when we think about the accessibility of it, there's so many different layers, based on socioeconomic status, based on sort of the invisible disabilities that exist, and these are ones that I know we are very much with our Office of Disability Resources really trying to address, but doing it in such a way that does not require someone to out themselves, that they need this, or hey, when you wear a mask, I can't read lips, or I can't see facial expressions, all those kind of things. So, therein lies, again, the deep challenge. But in terms of accessibility, I think that right there is the critically important piece. Because I know, our institution will provide masks to a point, but at some point the supply runs out, and then what do you do at that point?
Okay.
Can I add something on to what Jonathan just said? Also, going back to accessibility, I mean, right now if everyone remembers at the beginning of this, it was hard to even find a mask. You were hard pressed to find them, whether you went to a drugstore, a big box retailer, the hardware stores, the AutoZone stores, you just couldn't find them. I mean, I still can't find alcohol in all actuality. You can find masks now, but who's to say that we may not find ourselves in another situation coming up where, again, from accessibility standpoint, they're hard to find. There are some people who've probably found them and hoarded them. So it gets back to, if I can't find them, even if I can't find them at, the local dollar store or whatnot, then what are any of us going to do in that situation? It's just another element to that. Another thing I wanted to address real quick, just seeing that as we're talking about the outing of themselves, and I see a comment under what circumstance would it be necessary to know someone's gender. And I think the thing about that is it's not necessary to know someone's gender, but unfortunately we know people, we know that there are people who will use this as, they will use this as an opportunity to either force someone to reveal themselves in a way that they may or may not be ready to do on their own terms when it comes to telling that narrative, or just trying to, I always like to say, hijacking a situation for something else. And although our colleges and our universities are I like to think that we are all pretty much on the same page when it comes to equity as relates to sexual orientation, gender identity, things of that nature. The fact remains is that we never know what's coming out at the federal government level. I think we're all, I don't want to get too far off, but we're all still waiting to see, is there going to be something that's going to come down, for instance, from the Department of Education, Betsy DeVos, that has a direct effect on some of the conversations that we're already trying to have and how it may affect as students have to unfortunately out themselves in different situations and circumstances.
Mm-hmm. And you bring up a great point, when you think about having access to the mask, that there's still a number of stores that I've gone into that, can't keep them shelved. And ones that do, I'm starting to see the prices increase. It's funny, the closer we get to school openings, the more expensive these masks are getting. I was in the hardware store the other day. When I was there, actually a couple of weeks ago, you could get, a large box of disposables. They were, like $12. You go in there now, they're $25. So they're already starting to increase their prices because, they know that a lot of students are trying to stock up before they go back to campus. So what happens now when you don't have the financial wherewithal to be able to buy those? Again, it puts one at a distinct disadvantage. And so how do we address that?
So Jonathan, I want to switch gears just a little bit and talk about the mask in terms of colorism. And does it matter who's wearing the mask and what those masks look like? I know, for example, we have to give everyone in all of our institutions and each other some grace. We have to give people an opportunity to make some missteps, as long as we're all trying. One of the things that I know that our institution did that was something that we talked about was when we ordered the masks, they were first ordered, they ordered all Black masks. And so, of course, some people's thought process had nothing to do with how it would look on individuals, but which would hold up better and which would hold up longer. Because obviously, white would get dirtier faster, etc. But the Black, as a African American, I said, well, how is that going to look for our Black male faculty or staff or students, as opposed to some of the other individuals who be wearing those masks? So Jonathan, can you talk to us about this whole concept of colorism and how that would look in the mask potentially?
Yeah, absolutely. When we talk about, colorism, or color privilege, basically discrimination based on, skin phenotype, light versus dark, we see this playing out, all the time. But, now you add to that the mask and it takes it to a whole nother level, because when we talk about, particularly wearing the Black mask, and it's interesting that you bring that up because, in a lot of the research that I've done, we're starting to see more and more that Black men in particular, dark-skinned Black men, are being advised not to wear masks that are dark in color or are ominous looking, and tell them instead to gravitate towards brighter colors, preferably white, and those floral patterns, because that would be better. But again, better for whom? Because again, so in order for me to not be profiled, in order for me to be safe, I have to sort of conform and wear something that is less threatening. So there's a real challenge with that. But when we think about sort of the broader challenge or implication of the mask is it creates or exacerbates an already heightened sense of anxiety, because now there's that perception of how am I being viewed, and it's this notion that, that as people of color, having to look at oneself through the eyes of others. So we have to be cognizant of sort of the white gaze of, well, if I wear this in this way, how am I going to be perceived? You brought up, earlier, Christina, the notion of, what happens when you have a person wearing a mask and because it's the summertime and they're wearing a hat and they're wearing some sunglasses, now you cannot see anything, so how threatening does that become? And so that's really what we're starting to get into. And that's the concern when it comes to the notion of sort of discrimination and particularly with profile, because, here's the ultimate dilemma. Do I protect myself against the virus? And we know that, communities of color, particularly African Americans, are disproportionately high, in terms of the coronavirus diagnoses and deaths, or, those who see the mask as threatening. And what I saw as I was sort of scanning social media the other day, I saw this fantastic, quote from a young man that was both insightful and sad at the same time, where he said, I want to stay alive, but I also want to stay alive. And so when you have to make this grand choice of, Do I wear the mask to protect myself from COVID because, of pre-existing conditions, and we know that people of color, are contracting COVID at higher rates? Do I wear the mask to protect myself from a health perspective, or do I not wear the mask because I don't want to be profiled or potentially, harassed, by members of the community or the police? And so, when we think about that, one of the other interesting pieces that I think goes into this is the notion of, basing so much on physical appearance. There was one particular case that happened about 2 weeks ago. It was up in Detroit, where there was a woman, a Black woman, who was wearing a mask, and she was sort of harassed and threatened. And the person's, the police officer kept saying, sir, you're going to have to take your mask off. Well, it's a woman, and she was just a larger woman. She was, 6'3". She was about 200 pounds. So again, she was not used to being addressed in that way. The interaction became heated very, very quickly. It became tense, and so again, it's that notion of, wow, I look intimidating, through no fault of my own, but the mask makes it even more so. So does that become my responsibility, or does that become someone else's? And so when you kind of peel back that layer a little bit more, what we start to see is sort of that cross-race effect, or what's often called the other race effect, where we tend to be sort of hardwired to process or to not process facial differences often based on race. And there's a greater tendency to sort of individuate, you recognize those differences, excuse me, in other race faces, less than our own. So there's an inability for others to sort of differentiate who someone is, or what someone, what someone's intentions sort of would be. And so Dr. Brent Hughes, from UC Riverside, conducted, some research. He did a test, and he found that we are much more likely to generalize negative experiences if we see individuals as similar or interchangeable parts of a broader social group. And so when you now have this notion of being, threatening, we can't see who you are. You pointed out earlier, with your examples of people who were forced to take off their mask, or were sort of stopped. You mentioned the doctor in Miami. Well, there's another one that was really interesting that happened in Chicago. Cam Buckner was the Illinois representative, who's African-American man. He was stopped by a Chicago police officer after shopping while wearing his mask. And the officer asked him to see his ID as well as his store receipt. And when Cam Buckner asked the officer why he was stopped, the officer simply answered, "I can't see your face, man, and you look like you're up to no good." So, we start to now unpack those broader implications, these everyday tensions of being followed, or seen as a threat, now become heightened. They become, more exacerbated. We're already living in the time of racial unrest. We're seeing instances of police brutality. Then, we see what's going on in Portland with the protests and such. So, where does that end, and where does that leave us? So the question that I often ask, and I ask this often of my white colleagues, is what would it take to be less threatening? What would it take to make you feel more at ease? Do we fall into sort of that Claude Steele notion of, whistling Vivaldi, where I become a little bit more acceptable if, I look a little bit more like you, or I behave a little bit more like you? Well, what does that look like with a mask? And where I get concerned on our campus, because again, it's a rural community, that already students face, discrimination and racism just on an everyday basis. Add to that the fact that now they're going to wear a mask. How is that going to be, even a greater threat? And it kind of gets back to even more. Alan Serwer, when he wrote in The Atlantic a couple of weeks ago, an article where he talked about a racial contract, where the racial contract, is essentially a codicil that is rendered in invisible ink. One stating that the rules as written don't necessarily apply to non-white people in the same way. And so if we look at that as an example, We see that the white protesters who are armed with assault weapons, who are allowed to violate stay-at-home orders, and confront lawmakers without any repercussions, while Black and Latinx people in particular, in New York City, have been slapped with 80% of the social distancing violations. So you even have sort of a disparity in terms of application of law and how things are handled. So I think that's when you start to think about the profiling, when you think of the harassment, when you think of sort of the colorism that exists with masks. These are the very real threats that we need to start to be able to address.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. So we don't have a lot of time, but I do want us to discuss before we leave today, what are some of the policies and maybe some of the concerns that we should be thinking about as we head into the fall semester and the requirement of wearing the mask? So what are some of the guidelines that you've seen or that you've read about or that your institution has implemented? And what are some of the concerns that we should be thinking about? Like, for example, when we think about the enforcement, and you may not want to enforce it in your classroom, now that I have to enforce all of the rules and regulations of my classroom anyway, or on campus in my role as an administrator or as a staff member, now I'm adding on the added, now having to enforce masks, now having to enforce social distancing. And if I call our campus safety, then have they been trained? So what kind of things, that would be some of the concerns that maybe we would be looking at, but what are some of the concerns or guidelines that you would suggest or things for us to think about as we think about the mask in our policies? Latasha, I'll start with you.
There's a couple of different things. One thing that I would want our institutions to do, and if they're already doing it, maybe do a better job, is making sure that faculty and staff are comfortable and feel supported, that our voices are being heard. So if we say, we have a concern about being back in the classroom or being back in our offices or being on campus, that those things are actually listened to, and listened to a degree where we feel supported, regardless of what our decisions may or may not be. Again, as an adjunct, I don't necessarily have to take a class that I get offered to teach. But I know that not every adjunct has that ability. We can say the same thing with full-time faculty and administrative staff. Some of them may or may not be in situations where they can just say, what, I don't need this job, or I don't need the stress that's associated with it, so I'm out. But on the flip side, if they do need it and there is some stress there, we need to make sure that they are supported and that they know that there are, I guess, either the affinity groups or offices or things that are in place, because I think oftentimes, which often is not getting as much discussion, and some of these broader, topics related to the mask and how we're all, going back to our institutions, is it takes a toll on you mentally. It just does. And so if we can't be in a good place for ourselves from a mental perspective, then how are we going to be good for the students, for our colleagues, for our campus institutions? So, I think that's one thing that I feel like from a policy perspective, I'd like to see our institutions do a better job of dealing, or, at least just make sure that's part of the conversations when we reopen. Again, I see someone talking about the campus security is trained. I think that is key. And, three of us have had these conversations offline about what is the role of campus security, because I'm pretty sure the majority of us on the line have not really had to call campus security. We may not even know much about them. So you don't necessarily want the first time you interact with campus security to be a situation where it's just gonna go left really, really quick. Particularly, and what's the best way to say this? I think those of us who are people of color, or at least if you are a strong ally, you're concerned about the interactions that your students of color or marginalized student group members may have if they're dealing with campus security. So, it's a fine line, that you're walking right there, to make sure situations are addressed, but to make sure students feel like that they're supported by you as someone who should have their back. I think when we're also talking about other, guidelines or policies are in place, is maybe encouraging faculty and staff to even have some type of say so. I have been somewhat encouraged when I listen to some of my colleagues who say I'm actually a part of our campus task force. But the reality is a lot of us are not part of the different campus task forces. So, you got to make sure that there are people who are supporting all of us who are tuning in right now, who are actually representing, those needs and can have a strong voice at the table for what these policies are. And then, these things, they're just going to continue to change. As I look at my own institution, there are some things that they're still not very clear on. Now, classes are not scheduled to start until the end of August. They're still in the midst of summer semester. So I know they're just trying to get through that, and they're working on a lot of things behind the scene. But at the end of the day, if you're somebody such as myself, you want to make sure before you commit to a class that things are a little bit more in place, so you know what you're walking into and agreeing with, as opposed to just kind of blindly, going into the den of the lions, so to speak. So those are just, I think, just like a few things that I would just say from the get-go. Let's make sure that these, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm having a brain fart right now, excuse me. You're just wanting to make sure that these are some of the, I guess, foundational building blocks, but knowing that they're just blocks. I like to liken it to like a Jenga puzzle, if most of us know what that means. It only takes, one piece to kind of be pulled out, abruptly or not in the right place for the whole institutional program to just fall to pieces. But again, we have to continue to build upon and build upon and build upon and make it stronger, because we really don't know how long we're going to be in this situation.
And I think that you brought up, as well as one of our participants, about the de-escalation of our campus security. De-escalation techniques, though, aren't going to help them understand the fears that people may have as they readily approach them. So it's fine for them to have de-escalation techniques, but we need something more than just de-escalation. We need some cultural competency training or some race relations trainings to help understand and bridge those gaps as well. Because that's not what's going to, as you talked about, Latasha, you face a situation and then you call campus safety, especially for students of color, that already may make them tense as it is, and it may heighten the situation. Jonathan, would you like to expand upon that and then talk to us too about things that you would like for some of our institutions to think about in terms of policy?
Absolutely. The one that really has been, that I've been wrestling with for a while, and because I think it's incredibly important, primarily because mine is an institution that will be in person, at the end of August, because we made that decision. One of my concerns, is while we gave faculty the opportunity to opt to do online, courses, rather than the in-person, they could do it virtually or some form of hybrid. We didn't give that same opportunity to our students. And I know several of my students, and one in particular who, I mentor, she's a senior, but she will not be coming back to campus in the fall because her father has a number of health conditions and there's no one there to take care of him as well. So, she is sort of saddled with that responsibility. But, she could certainly have commuted and gone back and forth to campus, but, the doctor said that wasn't advisable. She doesn't have the option of being able to take courses online. So for all intents and purposes, she won't be enrolled in school in the fall, which means she's not going to graduate on time, in May. And so what now financial hardships will that, also add to her, down the line? So for me, I think those are some of the policies that I would like to see institutions in terms of being a lot more flexible in what they're offering. If you want to choose to do in person, that's great, but I think we still need to provide the options, for students to do it virtually, to have the same experiences. And that's something that, I know our institution is starting to talk about a little bit more, but I think more institutions need to be having that conversation. I applaud, institutions that have already made the call that their fall semester is going to be virtual. And hopefully, we've all had the benefit of learning from what happened this year to sort of prepare for some of those eventualities that will always arise, and have contingency plans. But I think it's a real opportunity for us to take advantage of, a little bit more of the technology and online piece. So for me, the policies that really stand out, are how are we best serving our students, and are we really taking into consideration what their needs are? I know a lot of institutions, and again, I've had conversations with colleagues, and their institutions have made the decision to go into in-person, classes because it's a financial situation. That if they went virtual, then it would actually cost some faculty positions as well as some staff and administrator positions. So we're talking about, the viability of institutions. And so, some of these calculated risks are being taken, and you just hope that they pay off and that you don't have spikes, in your COVID cases on campus, or that you bring everybody here and then, in a very short term, you have to shut everything down and send students away again, and you're back in the virtual environment. So for me, I think that's what's really the most pressing, is making sure that our students, have the experience that they need, and make sure that their considerations, are considered, or their needs are considered. Short answer, yes. Private institutions have the flexibility and the wherewithal to sort of enforce certain policies, even if it may fly in the face of free speech. Public institutions don't have that same benefit.
There's another question that says, how is wearing a social message on a mask different than wearing a social message on another piece of clothing like a t-shirt?
While it's very similar, I think it could be looked at a little bit differently. Let me put that in air quotes, because when you're sitting in the classroom, and correct me if I'm wrong, most of the institutions where you have to wear a mask, you have to wear that mask the entire time class is in session, whether the class is 50 minutes, an hour, in 20 minutes. I think that's some of the longer classes at Columbus State. So then I think it becomes more of a challenge, and I think sometimes it could be a little bit more intimidating when you're trying to interact with a fellow student, meaning like from peer to peer, or you're in your office as administrator with a student. It's something, because again, we're talking about the need to be able to make eye contact and make face contact. And so I think there's just, and this just is my own professional kind of sociological mindset, I think sometimes that mask, because of how we look at mask anyway, those messages on a mask can be viewed at as more intimidating and more threatening than a t-shirt. Not that we shouldn't be concerned about what we see on t-shirts, but I think it kind of ramps it up a little bit, I think, when it's on a mask.
So Krishana asked, at Christina's institution, who operates or monitors the check-in point?
We have assigned individuals at our check-in points who have gone through a process to ensure that they understand what would be perceived as appropriate. And again, if they deemed that they were not appropriate, we would just ask them to wear a mask that's provided.
And how and where do you set up a check-in station?
So on our campus, they are set up throughout different check-in points. Most often they're going to be in our buildings that are heavily, that have a lot of traffic. So that's going to be some check-in point. Also where we would deem as what we call our one stop, but that's where all of the financial aid and your academic advisors, et cetera, there also would be a check-in point. And then we would have it again in some of our other classroom buildings, as well as in the residence halls. So we have several throughout our campuses.
Well, Tasha or Jonathan, what about your campuses?
I have yet to hear anything about a check-in whatsoever going on at Columbus State, so I'll kind of have to pass on that one.
Right, I'm not familiar with anything either.
So Wendy Meaden said that our university has a statement in the student handbook's academic integrity policy that prohibits the disruption of the learning environment. Mm-hmm. Couldn't we use that as a basis for saying, quote, I'm sorry that masks is offensive to some of our class, so you may not wear it here because it is distracting from our work?
I think technically you could, but I think the reality is that it's a slippery slope because it gets back into who's making the decision or the determinant of what's offensive and what's not. Remember that old Mapplethorpe exhibit? You know, I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it kind of approach. And I think we run the risk of kind of walking that slippery line. It's one thing if someone were to have, you know, the N-word or something like that on a shirt or on a mask. I mean, that's very blatant. But some other things, particularly in this, let's just say current racial, political, social climate, where what's offensive to me may not be as offensive to someone else. I mean, I'm kind of piggyback because I'm looking ahead at the next question, which kind of feeds off into that. And so where I may think, for instance, that the Confederate flag is offensive, someone else may think that it's not. Then who am I to say that that's offensive to everyone? Now, I guess if, you know, everyone in the class stood up and said, we want this person gone, you know, then you kind of have to tackle that. But it doesn't mean that that student who is being ostracized or ridiculed then doesn't have their own due course where they can go talk to the dean or the assistant dean or whoever. So again, I think it's a slippery slope. I don't know if Jonathan or Christina want to chime in on that one.
No, you're absolutely right. And you know, I think what it really, you know, hinges on is how you are defining disruptive behavior. You know, how is it impacting the learning environment? And the challenge is, if you find someone's mask to be offensive and therefore disruptive to, you know, what's going on in class, it's as Latasha said, it's a very short step between somebody saying, well, I don't like the slogan that's on your t-shirt, that's disruptive, so that needs to go. Or the button that you're wearing on your backpack is, you know, disruptive and offensive, so that, you know, that you need to go. So we have to be very clear in how we are defining, you know, what disruptive behavior is. You know, it'd be interesting to hear what your institution's policy, you know, says, and do they actually clarify it or define it, or is that up to you faculty members in the classroom or administrators or staff, you know, in various offices to be able to determine that. But then again, you know, someone then gets to be the arbiter of what's disruptive or not, and that becomes a challenge. And that's something that we face on the regular basis, you know, even outside of COVID, you know, at our public institution, you know, because I know over the last several years, you know, and we've seen this, you know, across higher ed, but campuses have seen, you know, the proliferation of sort of white supremacist flyers and other, you know, activities on campus. And we've had, you know, some difficulties, you know, being able to address that because it didn't cross the lines of being sort of hate speech. And so it was protected. And so while we didn't like it and it was offensive, and we certainly provided some educational programming and training, you know, to address it. But in terms of, you know, policy enforcement of saying that this is the result and, you know, this is what's going to happen, this is the consequence if you do that, you know, we haven't been able to do that.
And lastly, I also think it relates to the support that we've all talked about earlier too. Do you feel supported? And if there are established precedents set for your campuses?
So I think that we kind of covered the next question because it just offers a specific example of the different ways that this can show up. So it says Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter are one thing, but what about a MAGA mask that some folks feel is racist? So I don't know if you want to. I think that,
yeah, I'll tackle that one. I think the issue with that is, again, a lot of it is in it's based on perception. Are you viewing MAGA as racist, or are you attaching the racist ideology to the person who may be wearing the hat based on how most of us view MAGA anyway? People who are, I'm just going out on a limb, I would assume that some people would say, well, me and my MAGA hat is more of a political statement because it represents my candidate, X, Y, and Z. But there are other people, and I feel comfortable saying myself included, will say, well, it's more just a political statement because it's attached to an individual who engages in white supremacy and racist ideology, which is a whole nother conversation for another webinar. But because of that, again, it becomes a slippery slope because if I'm the person either in front of the class or the administrator, I have to be willing to understand how I view that political element is not necessarily going to be the same way as someone else does. Look, I once had a student write to me in a paper about how, although they know that people view the Confederate flag as a racist symbol, they do not. They equate it with their heritage, what have you. I had to grade that paper not based on my own personal beliefs, but how they answered the question which they were supposed to answer, which they did a good job answering it as a symbol of deviant behavior. So again, we have to be very careful about how we approach this and make sure that we are not setting ourselves up also to be challenged. And when I say challenged, I mean on the risk of losing our paid jobs because someone felt that we were bringing too much of our personal perspectives into a situation that should be very professional. I think we all know we've worked with people who we give a side eye to and we're like, you know, you're saying some things and I'm pretty sure you're trafficking in it or at least walking the teetering line, but you still have to maintain a certain level of professionalism. So we have to be able to do that with our students and, to be honest, with some of our colleagues who might also be wearing some of these MAGA masks on our campuses.
Hope Williams said that at Indiana State, faculty are told to dismiss class if a student refuses to wear a mask, then report the student who refused to wear a mask to student conduct.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Carrie Johnson asks, what about those with disabilities who are unable to wear a mask? Are institutions prepared to make disability accommodations as required by law? And Dr. Rungu asked a question about what about faculty that are hard of hearing. So I think those questions kind of tie in together for folks who, you know, will likely need to wear a mask.
So at our institution, I'll tackle this one to begin with. At our institution, we do have policies if people cannot wear a mask, that they will need to seek a doctor's note or something from their physician stating that they cannot wear a mask, and then that will be honored. In our check-in process, they do have wristbands as part of it's an extensive process. So when they go into that process, we all get a wristband, and it's a different color for every day. And then there's a certain color if a person has a medical reason or has been seen from our COVID team and our HR department to not have to wear a mask. They don't have to tell anyone else, but they will have a different color wristband so that instructors or staff, anyone who is walking by will know that that person with that color wristband has already been approved not to have to wear a facial shield or a face mask. And what was the other part of the question, Asia?
What about faculty who are deaf or hard of hearing?
So for us, they have a COVID procedure. So if you go to bakercollege.edu, there's a whole list and litany of things that someone would have to do. But for faculty and staff who may have some issues or who may be hard of hearing, what they would do is contact the COVID team on that form, and then they would talk to some individuals at the institution, including our HR person, and they would talk to them. And then if they needed to, we actually are providing face shields as well now, because that actually occurred at our institution already. We had some concerns, so they addressed it right away. And so once they acknowledge or once they tell someone that they will need some other accommodations, those accommodations are made. And so now we even have Baker face shields that individuals can wear if they don't need if they can't wear the mask.
Yeah,
So face shields. So face shields become really important too, as well as masks.
Yes, because now with the face shield, at least, and someone else alluded, and we have these as well too, the mask with the see-through so that you can see, so that you can read lips, but also the face shield allows all of the coverings to come off. So it becomes easier for the instructor to see the students and be able to read lips. But again, if they feel more comfortable with the the mask, because they do cover more and they're more tightly fitting, then they actually have those that are see-through as well. I actually think we all should have the see-through one so we can see everyone smiling and so we can see what people are thinking about. Because it's hard to see through that mask. So that's what we're doing at our institution.
Any other responses to that? Okay. So Mary Ann Stupful Wallace says, would it help to discuss the issues of masks in class as a way to set up guidelines and codes of conduct? However, that would put too much pressure on instructors.
Yes, I would say yes, it would be very helpful to have that conversation if those conversations are not had prior to students starting in the fall, so that they understand what the expectations are for the classroom, for the institution, etc. It's hard for students or faculty or staff or any of us to do our jobs well, or for students to be able to engage when they don't know what the expectations or the rules are. So even providing an opportunity to have any type of COVID related information or mask information on websites, I would say would be very helpful for institutions to provide, so that students could refer back to that. And then in the classroom, if faculty wanted to discuss it even further, that would be helpful as well. But I would suggest having something for people to read prior to coming to class, so that they already know what the expectations are.
And Tatiana Diaz asked if we could get some examples of a disruptive behavior policy.
As it relates just for the mask, or for just in general disruptive behavior policies? Because if it's for disruptive behavior policies, we will be happy to take that information and each one of us can send her some information.
Okay, why don't we do that? Because we have about 4 minutes left. So Tatiana, if you want to send an email to the presenters, let us know and we can make sure you have everybody's email address. And someone said that they have a concern regarding HIPAA. How do you protect your personal and medical information if you are not wearing a mask for medical reasons?
That would be up to the individual to acknowledge or to seek further assistance in order to have that wristband. And at least for our institution, that is an individual right and concern, but they would have that wristband, and we all understand what that wristband is for. So that individual would know from the beginning that if you needed some special accommodations, you would get this wristband. No one questions you about that wristband. Everyone understands that there's to be no questions. And that's because otherwise, if a person was not wearing a mask, then they would be kicked off of campus, or they would not be allowed to be on campus if they weren't wearing it. So there has to be some policy put in place so that we understand, so that people know that this person is just not walking around campus, and so we don't have campus safety being called on them or someone else trying to remove them from campus.
So we have 2 more minutes. We lost one of our panelists. That's okay. Our internet.
No, I'm back.
Oh, okay.
My internet it wasn't happy, I guess, and it booted me off. But I'm back. I just can't broadcast my video right now.
There we go. I got you.
And just want to interject, I did just put into the chat 2 links to Adam Serwer, one to his podcast, The Racial Contract, and the other to the Atlantic article.
Are there any final or concluding thoughts as we move to close?
I think I just want to encourage all of us to stay encouraged and to not feel as if you or your institution, well, more so you, not to feel like it's just you having these questions and trying to navigate this. I think everyone who signed on because they're trying to see what other people are doing. Hopefully there's things that you heard that are supporting what it is that you're doing. Maybe you got some new ideas, but if nothing else, I just hope everybody came out of this feeling like, okay, it's not just me who has these concerns.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I would say, in these times of uncertainty, let us make sure that, we hold on to sort of 3 key traits, and that would be flexibility, adaptability, and resilience. And I see each one of these opportunities that we see, like with mask issues and such, as really an opportunity to engage in a discussion. And so that's what I would encourage people to do, is see this as that learning opportunity to engage, to challenge, step out of the comfort zone, because we are at institutions of higher education, and that's what we're about. So for me, that's the positive step to take. It's, how can we use this as a learning experience?
I would just like to thank everyone who has participated today. Thank NCORE, Dr. Arungu, Dr. Bisco, and Asia so much for all of their support for this webinar. As faculty and administrators, these are things that we are getting ready to face this fall. And we just wanted to have a conversation and to provide some perspective and some insight as to things that we are thinking about. And I also would like to thank my institution, Baker College, for sponsoring this webinar. Thank you so much.
Well, you all are going to be receiving the survey for the evaluation tomorrow morning sometime. So we encourage you to fill out the survey. That is how we strengthen our program and make things better. We are diligently planning the 2020-2021 webinar season. Please check our website, www.ncore.ou.edu. We have at least one that is scheduled for August. That's already posted. Registration will open soon. So thank you very much. Thank you to our presenters, and thank you to Baker College for sponsoring this. Thank you so much. If your institution is interested in sponsoring a webinar, please send me an email. Asia Meux, AJIAMEUX @ou.edu. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.